When I say the words sex offender, what comes to mind? Most people have an immediate, visceral reaction. I see it all the time on the faces of those who ask me what I do for work. When I say that I do therapy with juvenile sex offenders, most of the time people don't know how to react, whether to be shocked or disgusted or downright angry. A simple, casual conversation about our professions can suddenly become rife with tension as the other party struggles with their own preconceived ideas, the stories they've heard in the news, or maybe even their own history of abuse. Some people ask me, how do you work with those monsters? And believe me, I get it. I'm a therapist, but I'm also a mom. I have a teenage daughter, and the thought of anything like that ever happening to her is terrifying. Sexual abuse can be absolutely devastating, and it's difficult to imagine how anyone could cross a boundary like that. So perhaps it's easier for us to think of them that way, as monsters. We think of the creepy stranger, or the sick and twisted pedophile, or the sinister psychopath. It helps us to make sense out of something so senseless. They're evil, and they're ill, and they're nothing like us. But these stories that we're telling ourselves about sex offenders can be dangerous. And I'll tell you why. This is the story of a 15-year-old boy. His name is Jamar Pinkney Jr. When Jamar's mother found out that he had sexually touched his 3-year-old sister, she called his father to let him know. Jamar's father flew into a rage. He came to the house, pointed a gun at Jamar, and forced him to strip down naked. He then marched him outside to a vacant lot, told him to get down on his knees, and shot him in the face. Jamar's last words were, "No, Daddy, no." Jamar's mother, distraught, said she felt she had a duty to let his father know, but she had no idea that he would react this way. "This isn't something that you sweep under the rug," she said. "We said we were going to get him help." Now, when this story hit the news in 2009, most people were appropriately horrified, but many applauded the father for his actions, saying things like, "Well, it was for the best. He never would have gotten any better anyway." Or, "He was a sick pedophile. He deserved to die." Their own preconceived ideas, their own stereotypes, prompted them to vocalize support for a father shooting his own son in the head. And this is why these stereotypes around sex offenders can be so dangerous. Because when we believe that they're monsters, they can't become healthy young men. And why is that? Well, believing that they're monsters leads us to advocate for punishment rather than for rehabilitation. So rather than getting treatment, they do time. Or, like in Jamar's case, someone takes the law into their own hands. It perpetuates a stigma that keeps the families of abusers silent. They struggle to keep the secrets because they are fearful of what other people will think. But keeping secrets is a fundamental piece of sexual abuse. And third, and most importantly, if we're on the lookout for monsters, we miss what's happening maybe right in our own community or even in our own homes. The majority of the kids that I work with have sexually abused a family member or a close friend. So why am I talking about sex offenders at a TEDxWomen conference? It's a sensitive subject even among my colleagues, so believe me, when I was asked to do this talk today, I had more than one moment where I imagined torches and pitchforks. But we are all sons and daughters and mothers and fathers and members of a family and of a community. And of course, together we have a responsibility to empower our young women, to teach them to stand up for themselves and to speak up when they're being hurt. But we have an equal responsibility to raise healthy young men who grow up to empower and respect the women in their lives. I believe that one of the ways that we can do this is to break down the stigma around what it means to be a juvenile sex offender. So let's start with the facts. I work primarily with male adolescent juvenile sex offenders, so that's mostly what I'll be talking about today. Now, what is a juvenile sex offender? A child is only called a juvenile sex offender when he or she has been adjudicated by the court for sexually abusive behavior. What is sexually abusive behavior? It's any non-consensual sexual activity, including but not limited to sexual touching over or under the clothes, sexually explicit text messages, peeping, mooning, exposing oneself, oral sex, penetration. Now, that's not an exhaustive list, but the key features are that the behavior is sexual in nature and non-consensual. Next, in order to continue breaking down the stereotypes, we have to deconstruct some of the myths. What we don't fear, or what we fear, we often don't understand. So let's go ahead and get some of the facts. Myth number 1. Sex offenders are creepy strangers lurking in vans and dark alleys. Now, we know that's not true. We've seen the statistics that tell us that we're more likely to be abused by someone we know than someone we don't know. But when I started this talk today, and I asked you what came to mind when I said the word sex offender, who did you picture? The creepy stranger? Or someone in your own life like Jamar? The fact is, children as young as 6 have been referred to treatment for sexually abusing others, and most of the time the sexual abuse occurs with a friend or a family member. Now, why is that? I asked some of the kids that I work with, why not the girl sitting on the bus, or why not the little boy at the park? And what they say to me is, because I knew I'd get caught. They know that a stranger is much more likely to react strongly and quickly, and they don't have a relationship with that person, so that person is less likely to care about the ramifications of speaking up. It's also a much bigger risk to cross a line to touch a stranger sexually. When I ask a similar question, why your brother or why your cousin? They often say to me, because they trusted me. With family and friends, the boundaries are looser. They care about what happens to you, and they're more influenced by what you say and what you do. It creates more leverage to keep sexual abuse a secret. Myth number 2 is they never get any better. They all just go on to become adult offenders. In reality, the recidivism rates for juvenile sex offenders are actually very low. Different studies put the rate somewhere between 8 to 12%. So that means of the youth who are adjudicated for sexually abusive behavior, only 8 to 12% go on to reoffend and are adjudicated by the court again. So that means most juvenile sex offenders are not going on to become adult offenders. They have lower recidivism rates than adult offenders, and in fact, they have lower recidivism rates than juvenile offenders with non-sexual offenses. Myth number 3, they're all pedophiles. In reality, very few juvenile sex offenders meet the criteria for a pedophilic disorder. The key feature of pedophilia is an intense, enduring sexual attraction to prepubescent children. And while it's true that the majority of kids that I work with have sexually abused a younger child, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were sexually attracted to them. If I ask the kids who have abused a younger child why they didn't abuse somebody who was their own age or older, they say things like, I knew that I could get them to go along with it, or I was too shy to ask girls my own age. Myth number 3, juvenile sex offenders and adult sex offenders are exactly the same, and they should be treated the same way. Just like any other area of life, juveniles and adults are different. Kids' brains and personalities are still developing, and they're not fixed. So that means when they're provided with treatment tailored specifically for juveniles, they're often more amenable to treatment than adults. And the final myth, they sexually abuse because they've been sexually abused. While many juvenile sex offenders have been sexually abused, many have not. Just in the same way that some children who have been sexually abused don't necessarily go on to become abusers. Now, this can kind of be a difficult fact for us to grasp, because for some of us, this is one of the few ways that we can have empathy for offenders. But it's important to know because it keeps us from lulling ourselves into a false sense of security. Well, he would never sexually abuse someone because he's never been sexually abused. That's not necessarily the case. And that brings me into the question I most often get asked in the work that I do, which is from parents who want to know, how can I keep my kid from ever doing this to somebody? Because I have the opportunity to work with my clients and their families on such a long-term basis, I get to see them learn and grow and change together. And while I can't definitively tell you how to prevent sexual abuse from ever occurring to you or to someone that you love, I can share with you what these families have taught me about what they would do differently if they had another chance. The first thing is, talk to your kids about sex. And I don't just mean about the birds and the bees and out pregnancy and safe sex. Those are very important subjects. But talk to them about consent. Talk to them about good touch versus bad touch. Talk to them about their sexuality, about sexual arousal and masturbation. It's so awkward and uncomfortable, I know. The first time I had this conversation with my daughter, I can still remember the way she looked at me. Sort of like the way the cat looks when I roll out the vacuum cleaner, like, do I still have time to run? But it's really important. It helps them to understand that the thoughts and the feelings that they're having are perfectly normal. Another equally important conversation, also uncomfortable, talk to your kids about pornography. We'd all like to believe that our kids are never going to come across any kind of sexually explicit material, but the odds are they will. Whether they stumble onto it accidentally, or a friend shows them something, or they get curious, the chances are high. And the allure of looking at adult material is very strong. Talk to them about what it is, why it exists, what kind of impact it has on intimate relationships and expectations about sex. And talk to them about what to do with the arousal it creates. As awkward as it is, it's critical that we take care of our kids in this way. Take the secrecy out of it so that if they come across it, they're better equipped to handle the thoughts and feelings that arise. I can't tell you how many times in working with the young men that I do, one of them has said to me, I felt turned on. I didn't know what to do, but I was too embarrassed to ask. Check in with your kids often. And not only when something is going wrong, but also when things are going well. It's perfectly normal to think, well, they seem to be fine, so everything must be fine. But denial can be a powerful protective mechanism that keeps us from noticing little red flags. Share the facts. The next time you're talking to someone and you hear someone say something to the effect of, all sex offenders deserve to die, or spreading some of the myths that we talked about earlier, call them on it. Teach them what you've learned today. Talk to them about how perpetuating stereotypes like that actually causes more harm. In doing so, we can help our children to be more healthy instead of perpetuating stereotypes that lead to denial, silence, fear, and possibly more victims. Practice empathy. This can be so hard, and that's why I use the word practice. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to be okay with what they did, but the families of children who have sexually abused others often feel so isolated and so ashamed. They fear retaliation from others, and they often blame themselves. The heartbreak is compounded for parents who have both a child who is the abuser and the child that's been abused. So reach out to them and ask if you can help. When you provide that type of support, you're increasing the health of the family and ultimately the community. Advocate for the importance of treatment. After everything we've talked about here, it seems sort of obvious, right? Well, unfortunately, my program is the only one of its kind in the state of California. The only one. We can only admit a maximum of 20 kids at any one time, and treatment takes 18 months to 2 years to complete. As you can imagine, we have a really long waiting list, but unless you have a particular type of insurance, you don't qualify for services. That leaves a lot of kids that need this type of treatment without very many options. And a lot of parents don't even know that treatment like this exists. When I first started working with these kids, I didn't know what to expect. To be honest with you, I was scared. Turns out, they're teenage boys. They play football, they play video games, they love eating pizza. They look forward to getting jobs and going to college and starting families of their own. But they carry an enormous fear with them. What will people think of me when they find out what I've done? We have a responsibility to help them understand that they're not monsters, to reach out to their families to provide them with support, and to tell victims that speaking up will mean that their brother or their cousin or their friend actually gets help. In doing this, we're teaching our young men responsibility, empathy, accountability, and healthy boundaries, values that will ultimately help them to become loving husbands, fathers, and sons to the incredible women in their lives. Thank you.